Thank you, Laura. Thank you all for being here. We've had a great day so far in the UP. This is my third visit to the UP. I try to visit once a year. Maybe I could just spend a couple minutes and tell you why I'm here, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can ask me questions, and everybody can fire away. I like to make these really interactive, so please don't be shy. There's something unique about our country, and that is our central bank, which is the Federal Reserve, is designed to be distributed around the country. Because Congress said if they're going to they didn't like the idea of having a central bank at all, a bunch of bankers in a dark room doing God knows what. It just sounded very undemocratic. But our country was hammered with financial crises in the late 1800s. And so Congress said, well, I guess we need to have a central bank to manage these ups and downs. But let's not keep it all in Washington, D.C. Let's distribute it around the country so it more directly represents the people. So they created the Board of Governors in Washington. You've probably heard of Alan Greenspan, and then Ben Bernanke, and then Janet Yellen. The current chairman is Jay Powell, based in Washington, D.C. And then we have 12 regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And our jobs are to represent all of you. Our jobs are to represent our region, which is Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, the UP, and northwestern Wisconsin, to know what's happening here in the local economy, and then to bring that insight back to Washington, D.C. when we set interest rates for the country. So I try to come out here once a year at least. I've been to Houghton and Marquette in prior years, and I'm eager to hear from you. We had meetings with different groups talking about the job market, talking about the business climate, what's happening to wages, what's happening to housing. Would love to get your thoughts. It's going to make me smarter, but I'm also here to answer questions for you may have about the Federal Reserve, about the economy as a whole, or about monetary policy. So thanks for being here, and the more direct you are to me with your questions or your comments, the more I'm going to take away. So please don't hold back.
And I have to tell you that at the previous meetings, I was very impressed with your willingness to have dialogue, and it's something that I enjoy also. And so he's really serious about having the conversation. So the first question that I'll ask is, you have been widely heralded and criticized for your stance on not raising interest rates too quickly. Could you please give us a synopsis of your thinking on interest rates and the economy?
Sure. So one of the big surprises for us is in this economic recovery, the unemployment rate nationally peaked in 2009 at 10%, which is quite high. And since the job market has gotten stronger, the economy has recovered. Now nationally we're at 3.9%, which is a pretty low unemployment rate. We would have expected when that unemployment rate came down that wages would have taken off and that inflation would have taken off as the economy got stronger. Well, we've been surprised that wage growth has been quite low and inflation has actually been coming in below our 2% target for almost the entire time. And now it just barely hit 2%. And so I was simply saying when I voted against those interest rate increases, hey, let's wait till the economy continues to strengthen. Let's actually allow the wages to start to pick up. Let's not prematurely tamp down growth by raising interest rates. So here we are. Now, inflation has finally just come back to our target. Core inflation is at 1.9%. We try to aim for 2%. We're basically at our inflation target. But we've been surprised. Jobs keep getting created. People keep taking them, which is a good thing. And wage growth still hasn't picked up very quickly. You know, typically, we think that wages and unemployment are linked. You think the job market gets strong. Businesses have to compete for workers. They outbid each other. That drives up wages. So you think that these things are linked, but we haven't seen much wage growth. And so to me, I think there might still be some slack in the labor market. There might still be people who are not counted in that 3.9% unemployment rate. So I've been saying, hey, let's not overdo it. Let's allow the economy to continue to strengthen. And if we see wages pick up, we can always respond then.
Very good. What exactly is monetary policy, and how does that differ from fiscal policy, and why does that matter?
Sure. There's a big difference. In our mind, there's a big difference. So fiscal policy, let's start there. We all pay taxes. We pay local taxes, we pay state taxes, we pay federal government taxes, and then our elected officials decide what to spend that money on, whether it's healthcare or education or roads or defense. That's fiscal policy. How much we get taxed, and what that money gets spent on. And those are purely political decisions, and we can each discuss, and we can each have our own priorities, but the political system is designed to make those decisions. Monetary policy is separate. Monetary policy is the Federal Reserve adjusting interest rates up and down to try to smooth out the ups and downs of the economic cycle. So if there's a recession, typically the Federal Reserve will cut interest rates to make it cheaper to get a loan for a business to build a factory or for you to buy a house or to buy a car to stimulate economic activity. And then we typically raise interest rates if we think the economy is starting to get too hot to cool things off. That is simply, that is designed, we figured out over the last 30 or 40 years, that if those decisions on interest rates are made for economic reasons and not political reasons, the outcomes are a lot better. So there's actually a very bright line between fiscal policy and monetary policy. Fiscal policy is purely about political decision making and where the country decides to focus its priorities. And monetary policy is meant to be non-political, just focus on the economic data, not worrying about elections as an example, just saying how do we achieve our goals over the long term.
Thank you.
Sure.
So now we have a wireless mic. Who would like to ask a question? We have two, one over here and one over here. So somebody raise your hand. There we go.
And do me a favor and please tell me who you are. And I apologize, there's a bright light on us, so.
I'll stay under the bright light. I'm Nick Katz. I'm with the Upper Peninsula Power Company. You just talked about that difference between fiscal and monetary policy. To what extent does what's going on the fiscal side impact monetary policy, or to what extent does the Fed try and influence fiscal policy based upon an economic situation?
We don't try to influence fiscal policy, but we do pay a lot of attention to what fiscal policymakers are doing. I'll give you an example. So there was a lot of talk in 2017 about the possibility of a tax cut or some kind of tax reform. We didn't try to influence whether it happened or in what form it took. But once Congress decided, hey, this is what the new tax cut's going to be, and the president signed it, then we care a lot because it can affect how the economy grows over the next few years or over the long term. So then we update our models. We've got sophisticated computer models trying to forecast the US economy. If there's a big fiscal policy change, it can have an economic effect. We need to pay attention to that. Another example of this would be, we set monetary policy for the US. We set it for the benefit of the US economy. But we need to pay attention to what's happening around the world. So if China makes some big change or Europe makes some big change in how their economy is going to operate, that can then have effect on the US economy. So we're not trying to optimize for China, we're not trying to optimize for Europe, but we do need to pay attention because they can have an impact on the US economy that could affect the path of interest rates. So we pay a lot of attention to fiscal policy, but we leave those fiscal policy decisions for the fiscal policy makers. Thanks for your question. Others?
Thank you very much. So Matt Oney, I'm a chemistry and physics teacher at Escanaba High School and also teach a little bit here at Bay College as well. I'm just as a general curiosity, 10 years ago things were a whole lot different than they are now, and the federal government stepped in, and Dr. Coleman had talked about the bank bailout, and then also something very important to the state of Michigan was bailing out some of our auto industry as well. I know that it's speculation, but what do you think would have happened if the federal government hadn't stepped in? And I've heard a little bit about, the too big to fail and things like that. So what do you think would have happened if the federal government hadn't stepped in and bailed out those industries?
Well, this was, I joined Treasury in 2006. I was an appointee of President George W. Bush. And we considered ourselves to be a free market Republican administration. Let the markets work. If you take a risk, you get the benefit, but if you screw up, it's on you. No one's going to bail you out. So we were reluctant interveners. I think if I look back on time, the biggest mistake we made was that we always underestimated how bad the crisis was going to be. And so we were kind of dragged along to intervening until we ultimately said we just have to bail out the system. So what do we think would have happened? We think we would have been in a Great Depression scenario. We had 10% unemployment, even with the massive intervention by Treasury, by the Fed, by Congress. This massive, the US economy had a major heart attack. And so what do you do if you have a major heart attack? God willing, you get to the hospital and your doctor can do emergency surgery on your heart and stabilize you. That's what we did, but we still had a very long, hard recovery. So what do we think would have happened? Instead of 10% unemployment, if we'd allowed the financial system to collapse, we could have been looking at 25% unemployment. It could have been a scenario where you go to the ATM, no money comes out. How do you pay your bills? How do businesses pay their employees? I mean, it could have been that devastating, and that's what motivated all of us to try to do whatever we could to stabilize the economy. Now, we hated that we had to do it. It was the right thing to do. We never want to do it again. And that's why at the Minneapolis Fed, we've done a lot of work on the too big to fail issue around big banks. My view is that they are still too big to fail, that this could happen again, and that the best way to protect against that is to make banks fund themselves with more equity capital. And what that means is, when my wife and I bought a house, the bank made us put 20% down on our mortgage. The reason we have to put 20% down, that 20% is designed to protect the bank in case we run into trouble, right? It's a buffer. They can sell the house, get their money back. Well, big banks only put down about half that amount on their own investments. So if we made big banks put 20% down, that 20% would protect taxpayers in case the bank runs into trouble. We have not yet done that, and I think we should. Excuse me.
Hi, Neil. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
David Williams, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
President, Upper Peninsula State Bank. After your last comments, I now have two questions.
That's fine. You've got the mic,
Well, I
Go
may
as
not
long
give
as
it
you
back.
want.
So from a bank regulatory standpoint, on the heels of your last comment, do you see a point at which bank regulators would ease off, legitimately ease off on regulatory burden that banks are experiencing when they maintain capital of certain percentages or higher? And there's a bill about to pass right now, I hope it passes, 2155, that has some regulatory ease in it, but it doesn't go nearly far enough. And do you think with banks maintaining higher capital levels, you could see future easing to those banks that really represent no risk to the system?
Yeah, I would hope so. Certainly in the Minneapolis Fed's too big to fail plan, we basically said we need a lot more capital for the biggest banks, the giant banks, $250 billion and above, and a lot less or more streamlined regulations on small banks that are not systemically risky. But I think intuitively, if a bank has enough real capital, common equity, there's no reason that you shouldn't be able to relax some of the other regulations because they just simply have enough protection in case they make mistakes. So I think conceptually I'm aligned with what you're saying. And you're right, there is a bill pending right now in Congress. Now it's being branded as a community bank relief bill. When we analyze it, we think most of the benefits are going to the super regional banks. And they're wrapping themselves in the apple pie of community banking to try to get the bill passed. Whether it does enough for community banks, it sounds like you don't think that it does, but we certainly think it does a lot for the super regionals. And they're making record profits. I'm not sure what the problem is there that needs to be solved.
It is exactly that. There is some benefit to us, but it's truly minimal.
Yeah.
But at some point, anything is better than nothing. The other question I had is unrelated to that, but rather more to rate increases. And I know your position on rate increases, and I personally am concerned about ongoing rate increases. And at what point, I guess the question I have is, at what point do you think if the FOMC continues to move, they're going to push us? I know they want to get arrows in their quiver, and I get that. But at what point are they going to push us to a recession? Do we have 2 more moves in us? Do we have 3? Do you have any commentary from that standpoint?
Well, this is a key question. So part of what makes monetary policy difficult is there are a bunch of really key economic terms that we can't directly measure. I'll give you an example. So we don't actually know where full employment is. We know that the unemployment rate is never going to be 0, because there's always some transitions in the economy. But is 4% the right number? Is 4.5% the right number? Is 5% the right number? We're not sure. If you go below that, the theory is you go below that number, and then that leads to an inflation pickup. So that's one key concept, and we're not sure where that is. Second key concept that's really important that we also can't measure is what interest rate is neutral in the economy. That's neither stimulating the economy nor constraining the economy. And what we do know is that over the last 30 or 40 years, that neutral interest rate has been gradually declining. And it's been declining for a bunch of reasons, some of which are demographic factors. We know our society is aging. That changes savings patterns in the economy. We know that productivity growth has been slowing. We think that these things are contributing to this low, neutral real interest rate. So the reason I'm telling you that is a key measure that I pay attention to is what is, we call it the yield curve, telling us. The yield curve is is so the U.S. government borrows money from consumers and from individuals and businesses all the time. They borrow short-term for a month, let's say. They also borrow long-term for 5 years, a 10-year bond, a 30-year bond. And the interest rates of those different maturities form a curve. And what is the shape of that interest rate curve? That's the yield curve. Well, historically, the very best predictor of recessions is when that yield curve inverts so that long-term rates are below short-term rates. Well, the yield curve has been flattening for the past few years. And we're not flat yet, and we're not inverted yet, but we could be, we could flatten the yield curve by the end of the year. It really depends what happens to the long end of the curve. And so that's something I'm going to be paying close attention to get a sense of, are we overdoing it or are we coming close? I think that gives us some information about where neutral is, but this is part art and part science, so we're not exactly sure. But we should proceed with our eyes open. Hi.
Hi. You said that there's typically a correlation between unemployment and wage inflation, but you haven't really been seeing that as much. Why do you think that's the case?
Well, this is a really important and complicated question. One part of the reason, I think, is that there's more slack in the labor market than the 3.9% unemployment rate captures. So when you read in the paper, the American unemployment rate is X. Right now it's 3.9%. That only includes people who are actively looking for a job. So if you gave up looking, let's say you lost your job in 2009 and you couldn't find a job and you just gave up. Well, you're not counted in that unemployment rate. So we think that there are some people who are not counted that are still available to work if the jobs came back and if wages started to pick up. So part of the way this gets complicated is that as society ages, and we're aging as a society because we're just getting older, the baby boom generation, you would expect more retirees. So some of this mix of who's working and who's in the labor market and who's not, part of it's changing just because we're aging. But even if you look at people who are considered prime age, 25 to 55, these are the prime working years, about 1 million fewer Americans today are working relative to 2006 of those prime age workers. So that's part of it. I think there may still be more slack in the labor market. And then there's another concept where because people have gotten confidence in the Federal Reserve and confidence that we will keep inflation in check, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And this is something economists call anchored inflation expectations. So I'm sorry, this is getting technical, but back in the 1960s and 1970s, people lost confidence in the Fed. And the Fed was behaving for political reasons, not just for economic reasons. And then in the 70s, we had these interest rates and inflation take off in the 70s. And then in 1980 or so, then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker came in and cranked up interest rates to bottle inflation up and crush inflation. And then Republicans and Democrats said, you know what, we're going to keep the Fed independent. We're going to keep our hands off monetary policy. That has led to an anchoring of inflation expectations. And that is part of why I think the inflation has become less responsive to these changes in unemployment. Sorry, long answer to your question, but it's actually a really important, complicated question.
Question here. Mark Ponte with the governor's office here in northern Michigan.
Hi there.
Curious if, and this is a little off the wall perhaps, but in any of the Federal Reserve's discussions here in the upper Midwest, has there been discussions about the SULOCs at all? And what impact could have on the GDP if we have
about the
failure?
what? I'm sorry.
The SULOCs?
No, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Can you tell me about it?
Well, how much time do you have? I think there's just been an ongoing concern since probably the mid-'80s that we need to replace a lock. Of course, it's going to cost $1 billion. But some projections right now are looking at some huge impacts to the GDP if we ever had a failure there.
I see.
And I think it's something that it's sort of under the surface that I think it's probably worth raising here as a big issue for this country, not only just the upper Midwest.
This is the first time I've heard of it, so I appreciate you raising it.
Sure.
Thank you.
Jake Nyquist. I've been gravel mining and road building industry all my career actually, and I haven't seen any major road infrastructure funding since the 90s. That was the last time I saw a lot of road projects going on. There has been road projects since then, but nothing like I can remember from the 90s. And I know all over the Midwest the roads are crumbling. So in your opinion, does road funding, does that increase the economy when government put money into the roads? Does that actually boost the economy? Do they get that money back? And if not, if local governments have to start taxing at the local level to maintain our roads, at the local level, will that improve the microeconomy, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, good question. I think it's there's two elements the way I think about it. One is a short-term effect, and there's no question if either the federal government or state or local government spends money, you're going to get a short-term boost. And you're going to put more people to work, there are going to be more construction projects, you're clearly going to create a short-term boost. The question is it going to lead to longer-term economic growth or not? After the construction is done and the road is now in good shape, does that actually boost the overall economy over the long term? I think that's probably less clear at this point. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. It's probably case specific, one project, one at a time. You need to make that type of an assessment, as opposed to, say, the 1950s, when Eisenhower said, you know what, we're going to build highways all across America. That was laying a foundation for a long-term future economic growth. Now a lot of those highways have been built. So I think the case is, it's harder to make that it's going to lead to a big transformation in long-term economic growth. But you do hear, anecdotes in Minneapolis. Before I moved there, they had a bridge collapse. I mean, there are lots of examples of infrastructure that needs to be updated and modernized. And this, again, comes back to the core of fiscal policy, which is how much are we taxed and where should those tax dollars be spent? You understandably would advocate for infrastructure spending. Somebody else might advocate for healthcare spending. Somebody else might advocate for education spending. And how do we make those decisions? Because those are all good ideas. And that's ultimately where our political process has to make those decisions. But I'm with you. In the short term, there's a boost. Longer term, I think it's harder to say. Thanks for your question. Hi.
Hi, Clay Peterson with MBank. You had mentioned the division between monetary policy and fiscal policy and how the monetary policy monitors the fiscal side. Can you comment on the tax cut and what the Fed's expectation for it was and how do you see it tracking so far?
Yeah. Well, actually, the answer to your question is an exact related to the gentleman before you. Because when we look at the big tax cut that was passed, what was the immediate effect? One thing I heard from a lot of businesses was it led to a lot of optimism and excitement about their future economic prospects. But usually when I ask businesses, great, are you investing more? Usually the answer is no. Usually the answer is, well, we paid one-time bonuses to some employees. Maybe for public companies, we bought back some stock. Maybe we paid down some debt. Maybe we increased a dividend. So we know that if you just put more hands in Americans' pockets or in American businesses' pockets, there's going to be that short-term boost, just like the gentleman and I were talking about with the road construction. So we know that for 2018 and for 2019, GDP is going to be higher than it was without the tax cut. If you borrow money and spend it, you're going to have higher GDP, and that's what the tax cut is. The question is it going to lead to longer-term increased economic growth? That right now is unclear. It really is going to depend on, do those businesses and those people who got the tax cut, does it lead them to make more investments than they otherwise would have made? And we don't know yet. Hi.
So I have some questions about my rules of thumb.
All right.
Tariffs. I'm Mark Massicott with Lance Manufacturing. Being in a manufacturing company, I see the recession before anyone, and I come out of it before others. So you put tariffs on materials, and 100% of the time that I ran into that, you put me into recessionary pressures. Illegal immigration is another measurable that I monitor. Every time illegal immigration was down, that meant that jobs were going to change, and that was also recessionary pressures. Here we are, and I'm not feeling this recessionary pressure. Are you seeing any of that from where you're looking?
Well, I hear, so you raised tariffs and you raised immigration. So I hear a lot of the optimism that I heard from the tax cut from businesses has been replaced by anxiety about potential tariffs and trade war. Now, the trade war has not happened yet. The tariffs are not even actually in place yet, but you do hear anecdotes and stories of people raising prices because of the discussion of potential trade conflicts. So we don't know. Now, clearly a trade war would be a resounding negative for the U.S. economy. I mean, I don't think anybody disputes that. But I'm also sympathetic with the need that we do need to push China to open up their markets to U.S. manufacturers. You know, a lot of American businesses have told me and told other people, well, we wanted to go into China, and the Chinese government said, okay, you want to come in and sell it to our markets? Open a factory here. Or have a 51% joint venture partner with a Chinese business, which usually was a way to get technology transfer from the U.S. to China. Now, we don't do that. We don't impose those requirements on a Chinese business that wants to sell to us. So right now, I don't think anybody would say the playing field is level. And we should have a level playing field, and we do need to push them. And I've watched government officials for 20 years have very serious discussions with China, and then they go and do whatever they're going to do anyway. So I'm sympathetic with the need that we need to push them to have fair trade. But we also have to avoid the trade war, because it'll be bad for your business, it'll be bad for consumers, it'll be bad for everybody's business, and it would be inflationary. And then in terms of immigration, we know that economic growth comes in part from population growth. And our fertility rate keeps falling, as it does in most advanced economies. So we have to make that up somehow. Either we are going to, Japan is trying to subsidize fertility. Literally, they're paying tax credits to families to say, hey, have another child. That's expensive, and it takes a long time to work. So we either can use immigration to feed our economy, or we cannot. And that's a choice. That's a political choice that we have to make. Other questions?
Are you feeling the recessionary pressures?
Well, I mean, so far, mostly what I'm hearing from folks up here and around the region as I travel is optimism, that business seems to be going well. The number one complaint I hear from businesses, they can't find workers. They can't find the skilled workers that they want. In some cases, they're offering to train them themselves. In some cases, they're raising wages. I have not seen rapid wage increases. So I think it's optimism and feeling good about the future of the economy, and let's keep this thing going. So I'm not seeing much. People aren't telling me, well, we see this recessionary signal around the horizon or some pressure that's building, except for the gentleman's earlier question about the Fed possibly doing it if we were too aggressive on interest rates and we inverted the yield curve. Other than that, and concerns about trade, trade is the one thing that none of us can estimate where this ends up. I think everybody wants to avoid the really bad outcome, but that's, it's on a zero risk that a bad outcome could happen.
So you've mentioned a couple of times having workforce issues, whether it be for a specific industry or just a general challenge that we have currently, where you've traveled and have had businesses mention that they're having a hard time finding people. Where do you think education comes into that? Are we educating people these days for an economy that existed 20 years ago, or even at the present time, and not educating them for what we're looking at in the future? And so what are businesses saying about that?
Well, we know. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room knows how important education is to our own individual success, and it's only going to become more important in the future. Over time, we're becoming more of a technology-oriented society, and the importance of education, it just keeps getting more and more and more important. That's not going to change. So we have to find a way to educate a broader number of our young people at a reasonable cost, right? The solution cannot simply be saddle everybody with more and more debt. There have to be ways of educating more people, high-quality education at lower cost. So I think my best guess is it's not so much that the people are getting the wrong education, it's that not enough people are getting the education. And we were talking before we came up here about women now are exceeding men in terms of getting the college degrees, whether it's a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, or lawyers or doctors, more women than men. We got to get the men to catch up, right? And so we need to find ways of getting more. If I were to pick one demographic in particular that needs more access to education, it's just men in general. And maybe it's less about access. They probably have the access. They're just not availing themselves of the opportunity. And so I think that's a big question. But we are seeing, in response to this tight job market, we are seeing businesses now going the extra mile to say, you know what, I want a skilled worker. I can't find the skilled worker, so we will train you. Just show up at 8 o'clock every day, and we will train you. Or in some cases, you know what, we won't do the drug test for this certain job. We don't need to do the drug test anymore. Or we don't need to do the criminal background check for this certain category of jobs. So we're seeing businesses responding to the tight job market by doing extra things that are in their own interest to try to bring workers into the workforce, and that's a good thing. How about here? I asked this of an earlier, sorry, a gentleman has a question.
Michael
Go ahead.
Morgan, First National Bank and Trust Company. I'm interested on the Fed's perspective in terms of, granted, wage inflation does not seem to be ticking up, but I think anybody who's in the business world notices that total employment cost to employers is ticking up noticeably with benefit costs. How does that factor into your inflation outlook?
It does. We include it. We have a bunch of different measures of inflation, and there are government economists whose whole careers and whole day is spent getting as much data as they can and crunching it in a repeatable way. And so it does factor in benefits in our measure of wage inflation overall. And right now it's growing at around 2.7% as an annual rate. As a point of comparison, back in 05, 06, it was around a 3.5% annual rate. So wage growth has picked up a little bit in the last few years, but it's still well short of where it was before. Microphone's going to come up here to the front. No, but we got people watching on the live stream.
Hi, I'm Pat Rudden, Investment Officer for First Bank. You were just to mention the word locally, and I'm wondering, here we're seeing a lot of retirements, long-term employees, and I don't know, that's probably reflective of other parts of the country as well. So the top end of the payroll is coming down. Is that maybe what's keeping wage inflation low?
That's one of the theories that the mix of the workforce is changing, just as you said, as older, more experienced people are retiring and younger, less experienced, cheaper people are refilling them. That always happens, though. That's always the case. Every year that's the case. Now, maybe that mix is shifting a little bit more now than it was 10 years ago, but in any year in American history, older people retire, younger people come in. So I'm not sure how big an effect that is and what's keeping wages low. I mean, we know that wage growth is in part tied to productivity growth. So if a business is able, or the country as a whole, is able to produce a lot more goods or services for the same input, that accrues to the owners of the business, they benefit, but generally speaking, the workers benefit too. And so one of the reasons that wage growth we think is low is just simply because productivity growth is lower than it has been historically. We don't have a good explanation for why productivity growth is low. We don't have a good explanation for when it's going to turn around, but we do know those two things are linked. My guess is that is probably a bigger factor keeping wages low than it is the retirees being replaced by younger workers, just because that happens all the time. But by the way, one other thing on the retiree point, you hear a lot of stories about the retirement crisis that we're facing in America. Like Americans have not saved enough to retire. The answer is, you may not like it. You're going to work longer. I mean, if you are physically capable of working longer, you're going to end up working longer. And we're already seeing that. So one of the reasons that the workforce has been exceeding our expectations over the last few years is that retirees are choosing to work longer. And by the way, I think that's a good thing. If people are fit, they're able to work and working and putting food on the table and a roof over their head, I think that's good for everybody.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment on the Fed's perspective on the raising interest rates and the impact on the federal government debt.
Well, that's an example of the separation of fiscal and monetary policy, but how they can relate in a sense. So you're right, when the Fed raises interest rates, it tends to raise the borrowing cost for the US government. So when you pay your tax dollars to the IRS, part of that money has to go to service the existing debt that's out there. The rest of the money goes for education and healthcare and roads and defense and other things. And as interest rates go up, the percentage that the government then has to spend on servicing that debt goes up. And with all due respect, that's not the Fed's job, and that's not the Fed's problem. Congress has said to the Fed, you have two goals. Our two goals are stable prices, which is an economy that's not overheating or not limping along, and maximum employment, as many Americans are able to work who want to find jobs. And we're supposed to manage interest rates to achieve these two goals over the long term. It's not make it easy. Our job is not to make it easy for the Treasury to meet its fiscal obligations. And so that is purely the domain of Congress and the executive branch. That's not something we factor into our analysis, and nor are we supposed to. That's how we try to keep the Fed separate from those political calculations.
Any more questions? Okay.
Go ahead, in the back.
Hi there, I'm Joan Kimball with Invest UP. I have a question. I just did a presentation the other day and came across a really daunting statistic, and it was about the opioid crisis, and in particular with neonatals, so newborns. And rural America has faced some real issues with this crisis, and just with the workforce we have today. We're talking about talent and workforce and the issues we're having finding people, but finding people who don't have an addiction on top of it. Now looking forward to the future and looking at newborns. You know, I saw this really daunting statistic that said that in the region of the Upper Peninsula versus Detroit, it was a recent article that was printed in the Detroit Free Press, that we're ahead of Detroit in regards of neonatal births, newborns coming in with some sort of drug addiction. How does the Fed think about that when they're thinking about workforce and they're thinking about, you know, policy moving forward? And this is obviously going to be a very expensive, not only on a human factor, but a very, very expensive for health care and other factors that affect the economy. How does the Fed think about that looking forward?
Yeah, thanks for raising it. We think about it a lot because it helps us to, these factors are really important in helping us determine how many Americans are available to work. So for example, I mentioned earlier that if you just look at the prime age population in America, so 25 to 55-year-olds, that's considered prime working age, we're about 1 million shy of where we should be back in 2006 or 2007 in terms of number who are working. So the question is, how many of those million could actually take a job if wages picked up and they chose to work? Well, if they're hooked on drugs, they won't be able to. So we're trying to get a handle on how big is that opioid crisis, or drugs more broadly, as it relates to the available workers in the country. So that's one factor. Another factor is our criminal backgrounds. So people either who are currently incarcerated or who have a conviction, and maybe that's keeping them out of the workforce. So we are trying to analyze this to get a sense of how much labor availability is really out there. So it is an important issue for us, as it is for everybody, but we look at it through the lens of what does it mean for the job market. Follow up? Yeah, go ahead.
And it's the second part to my question. Earlier, somebody was talking. I think you touched on it as well. People who are unemployed but are, have not gone back into the workforce. How does the Fed also take into consideration people who are holding down 2 and 3 jobs to be able to pay their current rents, like in Chicago, where if you look at current average wages versus the rents, how do you look at those communities or places up, in rural areas where people are having to hold down 2 and 3 jobs? So they're counted as being employed, but they're holding down many jobs to be able to pay the bills.
Sure. We do try to look at that. I think I would admit, for me, I have less visibility into how many people have which jobs, but we do pay attention to wages. So one thing that would help that person that you're speaking about, if we did see better wage growth, the hope is that it would help alleviate some of those pressures. And as wages started to pick up, people would more readily be able to afford a place to live or afford to put a roof over their head, et cetera, pay for all of their expenses. So we do pay attention, but I think we have less visibility in some of that than you might here being on the ground. Because when you look at the aggregate statistics, we're looking at the number of people who are working, how many hours on average people are working, what are the wages that they're getting, but we lose sight of some of those individuals that you're speaking about. And that's why I'm here, so I can hear from folks like you about what you're seeing, because sometimes the data doesn't show it to us.
Good. It's a good lead into what I was going to ask. My name is Kathy Flagstead, and I work with Michigan Rehabilitation Services. It's a state agency that helps people with disabilities gain and maintain and upgrade their skills. My question to you is, what are your thoughts on employer tax incentives? There's currently one called the Worker Opportunity Tax Credit, which works with people in the special populations, of which you have mentioned, people with criminal backgrounds, people that maybe have been on TANF, temporary aid for needy families for a long period of time, and people with disabilities, people that I work with. And we offer that for employers. It's a simple piece of paper to fill out, and what I normally get when I'm going out in the field to work with employers, I've offered to fill it out for them. All they have to do is sign it and put their federal ID number. I don't want to do that.
Why not?
That's what I say. Why not? It's a federal tax credit off your federal tax return as an employer. Too much paperwork. I'll do the paperwork for you. I don't want to mess it in my business. They're not. They're going to give you a tax refund. So what I propose is maybe some more education for local employers from the feds, including the state. I mean, I think the state could do a better job at advertising the WOTC. There's like, I'm thinking 5 or 6 different categories, including veterans. And a lot of the people that are unemployed simply need a chance. They have abilities. It's just people aren't giving them a chance, maybe because they have a criminal background or they have a drug habit and they're in recovery now. Are they going to slip and fall off that, proverbial wagon? Maybe. But if we give them a chance and they get some self-esteem and the employer sees that and can then say, hey, this person worked out well for me. I'm going to hire somebody else with that program. And by the way, I got a tax credit to do it. So I think that would go a long way in helping employers, helping the workforce, helping get people that have fallen off the radar for employment to find employment. Just give them a chance, and the employers win too. It's a win-win proposition.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your comments, and I hope your neighbors here heard about the program from you right now. We're seeing, I mentioned this, we're seeing businesses, because there's, people talk about they can't find workers, so they're now having to do this stuff. And they're doing it, they're not doing it out of a sense of charity, and I'm not blaming them. They're doing it because it's in their own interest. Because, okay, well, I used to be able to just put up a wanted ad, and I'd have 10 people applying, and now I can't do that anymore, so I need to work a little bit harder. Yeah, I can apply for this program and get a tax credit, or I can, no longer, again, obviously, I was talking to somebody earlier today, so, well, I've got a forklift truck driver, I'm going to drug test him. Nobody's saying you shouldn't do that. But some businesses have said for certain positions, you no longer need to do the drug test or the criminal background check. I think businesses are waking up that they have to do these things in order to meet their own business needs. And so I think it's a good thing. And I'm with you, and the good news is somebody from the governor's office is here, can help you get the message out.
Hi, I'm Bob Bink with the State Bank of Escanaba.
Hi, Bob.
We constantly hear about Social Security on its way out, that in such and such a year it won't be available any longer, and I find that a little difficult to believe. But what is your opinion on that? Do you have any knowledge of?
So this is these programs are these entitlement programs are designed that current workers pay for current retirees. That's how the programs have been designed forever. And as our society ages, the number of current workers goes down relative to the number of retirees. So the math is simple. The math is the programs go in the red. So how do you solve this is actually pretty easy. You have a number of choices. You can raise the retirement age as people live longer. You can change the rate that benefits grow, indexing it to inflation. You can means test it, so they're focused on low-income families. You can raise taxes. There are 4 or 5 different choices. Now, each of us would probably have our own individual preferences on which of those levers we would choose to pull to balance it. So the math is simple. The hard part is the politics. And how do you get people to agree on which combination of levers to pull to balance it? So I'm with you. It doesn't need to fall over, it doesn't need to collapse. But somehow the country, through our political process, needs to reach consensus on how to make these decisions. Because if you just left alone, it will just crowd out other spending priorities. And then as we've talked about, somebody wants to focus on infrastructure, somebody else wants to focus on education. We've got Social Security, we've got health care. We've got a lot of worthwhile things to spend on. How do we make choices? That's what our political system is for.
David Williams again. Kind of a different direction here, access to credit. And Dr. Coleman, you might even have a perspective as well. But as a banker, we see student loan debt going through the roof. We get mortgage applications from people, and it's a big factor that they're carrying with them large dollar amounts. And I read frequently about that potentially being another crisis of people having that kind of debt. And I'm curious if you have a perspective on that as to whether you think it is or isn't, or what we could do about that.
You want to start?
They should all go to Bay College and get a less expensive beginning start rate. And then I mean, that truly is the piece, is that if more people would just go for 2 years at a community college, it would reduce their cost factors a whole lot. And in fact, the savings that they would have over those 2 years would pay for a full year of university education. And so it just makes a whole lot of sense. And here at Bay, they can go for 3 years and then go 1 year at LSSU, never leave the city, and get their 4-year degree, and that's the least expensive way that you could possibly get it. Now I'll turn it over to you and how you're going to deal with student loan debt.
Well, I don't think we see a crisis brewing like the housing bubble bursting and causing an economic collapse. But there's no question, I mentioned earlier, education is just becoming more and more and more and more important. We need to find ways of educating more of our young people, whether it's through 2-year certificate, associate's degree, 4-year, or grad school. And we need to find a way of doing that without just ever increasing more and more debt. You know, when the crisis hit in 08 and 09, state budgets got hammered because of the Great Recession, and then the safety valve was student loans. Because states across the whole country said, we're going to cut back, we have to cut back, so they cut back on funding of higher ed, and then the burden was just shifted to families and to students to take out bigger and bigger debt. So I think that's part of why you have such a big bubble now, balloon of student debt, so to speak, and that we can't keep doing that. So I think we need to push one another to look for more efficient ways of educating more people. Maybe some classes can go online, not everything can go online, but some things can, and maybe better alignment. We were talking earlier about alignment between the curriculum and businesses directly so that there's a pipeline to meet the needs of businesses. I think there are lots of things that we can do to try to educate more people at lower cost.
Okay, I get to ask. Oh, no, we got one more. There you go. Go ahead.
I know you analyze a lot of data, and you've heard a lot of things today about Upper Michigan. How do you think Upper Michigan is doing in comparison to your other regions?
I think the UP's or Upper Michigan is doing well. I mean, I think overall, everybody always has their own little pet peeves and little things that they wish could be a little bit better. But I think overall, people felt quite optimistic about the economy. Things are going well. The housing challenges didn't seem abnormal compared to everywhere. I mean, we live in a market economy. So in a market economy, things adjust until they come into equilibrium. Prices adjust. And so that means you're rarely going to see an environment where there's just tons of cheap housing everywhere, because prices are going to adjust and people are only going to build to meet the needs of the people who have jobs. And so it feels like things are going pretty well. People are able to find good jobs. By and large, yes, some businesses said they can't find as many workers as they would like, but I also didn't hear that much pain. I mean, when I asked some businesses, hey, are you no longer doing the drug test or no longer doing the criminal background check? The businesses spoke up and said, oh no, we're still doing that 100%. Well, it's okay. Well, then it can't be as bad as you're saying at first blush. So it sounds like things are going quite well here. But I also recognize, I learned today about the regional variations. Right? The UP, it's not one UP. Different parts of the UP are performing differently. And here, it sounds like things are going pretty well and people feel optimistic about the future. Which is pretty good. Did you have another one?
I have a question that just really intrigues me.
Okay.
Bitcoins. Honest to Pete, I look at that and I think, my gosh, I can't believe people are investing in that. If the stock market crashes, it's the first thing that's going to go. But I kind of a nutnoid on the stock market. But so we're hearing about it like it's going to be this new currency. Now there's competing Bitcoins. I don't know all the different little names that they've got. What do you think about this? And yeah,
it's a clever idea that some people came up with, I don't know, 6 or 8 years ago, but now it's being taken to ridiculous extremes. So if you go back in American history, there was a time when every state and different banks issued their own currency. And then you had runaway inflation because people just got confused. There are all these different currencies. What can you trust? Is one being printed a lot of? So finally the US government came in and said, no, there's going to be one national currency. It's only going to be issued by the US government. And that's how we're going to control it. And it's going to be, you have to have faith in the US government. That's why you have faith in the dollar. Well, now Bitcoins, or cryptocurrencies they call them, as of a couple months ago, I saw that there were 1,600 versions that have been created. So the barrier to entry to creating a new cryptocurrency is zero. You could go create one, basically. And if you can dupe enough people to buy it, you can pretend that you've launched something, and you can say, look, I'm a billionaire because I sold you one, and I own the other 999 million of them, so that means I'm a billionaire. So it's become a farce with all of these different things. Now, does that mean it's always going to be a farce? No. There'll probably be a shakeout, and maybe a handful of these things will end up surviving, and who knows what the future holds. But right now, I'm seeing more noise and more fraud than I'm seeing anything useful. We'll see what happens in the next 10 or 20 years.
So we have time for a couple more questions. Does anybody else have a question? There we go. Okay.
Hi, Bob Olson. I'm not in banking or business or anything. I just came here to possibly get a line on some information, some answers. There's a lot of negative information out there about the Federal Reserve, tons of it. I've tried researching information as a counterpoint, and there doesn't seem to be too much out there. Even on the Federal Reserve website, everything just seems to be kind of platitudes. Is there anywhere I can go? I'm sure you know the kind of information I'm talking about. Is there anywhere I can go to get some counterpoints to kind of balance that out and bring some things up to some people to show them to say, that's not true, because take a look at this. You know what I mean?
Well, we try, and I'd be happy if you have a couple of the negative points you want to throw at me right now. I'd be happy to try to respond. I mean, we try on our various websites. Sometimes they get kind of technical and jargony, and we try to simplify it. So we are trying to push back on the misinformation and give people real information. But fire away if you've got a couple you want to.
Right. Well, that's one of the things is that the Federal Reserve is not part of the government. It's a privately owned foreign corporation. And then right in here, this VAG says it's an independent entity within the government that is accountable to the public in Congress. So what is the Federal Reserve exactly?
Yeah, so it is complicated, and this is where sometimes the truth, we always want to be truthful. Sometimes the truth is a little bit nuanced. So if you go back in American history, Alexander Hamilton created the first central bank in the United States. Then they got rid of it because they just didn't sound like it was very democratic. Then they got a second one, then they got rid of it. Then I told you they had all these banking panics. So Congress said, well, I guess we need to have one. But they didn't want it all under the control of the federal government. They didn't want the executive branch controlling it. So the way they came up with this hybrid structure with a board of governors in Washington, D.C., all of the board members in Washington are appointed by the president, confirmed by the United States Senate. But then you've got 12 independent regional Federal Reserve banks, including the Minneapolis Fed. I was not appointed by the President of the United States. I was appointed by a board of directors of leaders from around our Federal Reserve District. In some cases, they're CEOs. In some cases, they're other business leaders. In some cases, they're educators or nonprofit leaders. They made the selection for me. And so we are a quasi-private, quasi-public institution that's designed to keep us away from control by Washington, D.C. And so it sounds weird, but it was actually designed to make us more independent. And so I'll give you an example, a counterexample. So usually when a new president takes office in Washington, D.C., you have U.S. attorneys that work in the Justice Department all around the country. Generally speaking, they all get fired, and the new president appoints all new U.S. attorneys. Well, the Federal Reserve, the President of the United States, can't fire me. That was designed by Congress in 1913 to keep us independent. And that's how we are. And by the way, all the profits that we make, when we make money off of services to banks, as an example, 100% of our profits go to the taxpayers. So we are 100% working on your behalf. All of our profits go to the taxpayers, but we are meant to be independent from the direct control of the executive branch. And so that's why it's a complicated answer to an important question.
So then it's not true that the Federal Reserve is owned by the Bank of England?
No, that is 100% not true. Yes, that is 100% not true. So I wish you just started there. I could have said, that's just not true. So that's a good question. Let us think about that. I mean, another thing that's another bunk that needs to be debunked is people say, you know what, we should audit the Fed. The Fed needs to be audited, right? Who can be against that? And it's a great political talking point, and people get all worked up, except for the fact that we are audited every year. We have an independent auditor, one of the big auditing firms comes in and audits us, and if you go to federalreserve.gov, the audit button is right there on our website for anybody to download. But it's a great political talking point. We want to audit those Fed people. Yeah, we are audited, thanks. So, appreciate your questions. Well, let me say thank you. I appreciate you all coming out tonight, and the UP has always been very hospitable and very warm every time I have come and visited, and I really appreciate that. I've learned a lot on my visit. I've got another meeting tomorrow, and then I'm heading to another part of our district. I'm heading to North Dakota. But I really appreciate you, and thank you for hosting us and kicking off the Q&A.
Thank you so very, very much. Let's give him a round of applause for all of his great work. Thank you.
Thank you.